The telegram arrived at the Tascosa, Texas post office on a blistering July morning in 1882. And when Garrett Foster unfolded the thin paper with calloused fingers, he discovered that his future wife would be arriving on the noon stage in exactly 3 days. He stood there in the dusty street, sweat already dampening his collar despite the early hour, and wondered for the 100th time if he had made the right decision in placing that advertisement for a mail-order bride. His ranch needed a woman's touch, certainly, but more than that, the silence of the empty house had begun to echo louder than any sound he had ever heard. Garrett was 27 years old and had been working his cattle ranch alone for the past 2 years since his father died, and his mother followed 6 months later, her heart simply giving up without her husband beside her. The ranch sprawled across decent acreage about 5 miles outside of Tascosa, and though it was not the largest spread in the Panhandle, it was honest land that yielded honest living for a man willing to work it. Garrett had always been willing to work, his hands hardened by rope and wood, and every manner of labor a ranch demanded, his shoulders broadened by hauling feed and mending fences and wrestling stubborn cattle through gates. He was a good man, people said, fair and quiet and dependable as the sunrise, with dark hair that always seemed to need cutting and gray eyes that held a thoughtful quality most folks found comforting. The woman's name was Zelda Lawrence, according to the letters they had exchanged over the past 4 months. She had written in a neat, careful hand about growing up in Philadelphia, about losing her parents to illness, about wanting a fresh start somewhere far from the city's crowded streets and suffocating expectations. She had mentioned having no siblings, no close family to keep her in Pennsylvania, and Garrett had appreciated her honesty about her circumstances. He had been honest in return, describing the ranch and the work and the isolation that came with living so far from town, wanting her to understand what kind of life she was agreeing to before she made the journey west. What he had not mentioned, and what she had not mentioned, were the 100 small truths that letters could never quite capture. Garrett did not write about how he sometimes went days without speaking to another human soul, or how the loneliness had begun to feel like a physical weight pressing against his chest, or how he had started leaving his parents' bedroom door closed because passing it made his throat tighten. Zelda, for her part, had not written about the calluses on her palms, or the way her back ached from years of work that no proper lady should have had to do, or the shame that came with arriving at this desperate solution to her circumstances. The stage arrived precisely at noon on the appointed day, wheels churning up dust that hung golden in the summer heat. Garrett stood outside the depot with his hat in his hands, his best shirt buttoned to the collar despite the temperature, watching as the driver climbed down and opened the door. 2 men emerged first, businessmen by the look of their suits, already complaining about the heat and the dust. Then a woman's hand appeared, gloved in pale blue fabric despite the oppressive weather, and Garrett straightened his shoulders as Zelda Lawrence stepped down into Texas sunlight. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but something about her face caught and held his attention. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark blonde hair pulled back severely from a face that showed both weariness and determination. Her dress was well made but dated, the kind of garment that had been carefully maintained for years beyond its original fashion, and she clutched a single worn carpetbag in her gloved hands. Her eyes swept the platform until they found him, and he saw her take a quick breath before she moved toward him with squared shoulders and lifted chin. "Mr. Foster," she said, and her voice was steadier than he had expected. "Miss Lawrence," he replied, settling his hat back on his head. "I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long," she said simply, But I am here now." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, two strangers bound by letters and promises, until Garrett gestured toward the wagon. "I have a wagon just down the street. We can head to the ranch once you are ready. Or if you would prefer to rest in town first, there is a hotel." "I would like to see my new home," Zelda said, and something in her directness made him like her despite his nervousness. "If that is acceptable." "Of course," Garrett said, reaching for her carpet bag. She hesitated just a fraction of a second before releasing it to him, and he noticed how she kept her hands clasped together in front of her, the blue gloves pristine and smooth. The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour, the wagon rattling along the rutted road while the sun beat down mercilessly. Garrett tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks and neighboring properties, but Zelda's responses were brief and distracted. She kept looking at her hands, at the gloves that surely must have been stifling in the heat, and several times she seemed about to remove them before changing her mind. Garrett wondered if she was nervous about the wedding, which they had agreed would take place the following day, to allow her some time to settle in, and to give him time to arrange for the circuit preacher to ride out. When they finally crested the rise that revealed the ranch spread out below, Garrett watched Zelda's face carefully. The house was modest but well built, a solid wooden structure his father had constructed with care, painted white with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. The barn stood behind it, freshly repaired, and the corrals held several horses and a small herd of cattle that had been brought in close for working. It was not grand, but it was home, and Garrett felt a sudden fierce hope that she would see its worth. "It looks like a place where someone could build a life," Zelda said quietly, and the words seemed to carry more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Garrett showed her inside, pointing out the kitchen with its cast iron stove and hand pump for well water, the sitting room with furniture his mother had chosen, the two bedrooms that opened off the main space. He had cleaned everything thoroughly in preparation for her arrival, scrubbing and dusting until his hands were raw, and the house smelled of lye soap and fresh air. Zelda moved through the room slowly, touching surfaces lightly with her gloved fingers, and he could not read the expression on her face. "The larger bedroom can be yours," Garrett said, his neck flushing hot above his collar. "Until after tomorrow, I mean. After the wedding. And even then I would not expect. That is, you should know I am not the kind of man who would demand." He faltered, embarrassed by his own awkwardness. "I understand," Zelda said, turning to look at him directly. "You are saying you are a gentleman." "I am saying we barely know each other," Garrett replied. "Letters are one thing, living together is another. I figure we ought to take time to adjust." Something in her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you for that kindness." That evening, Garrett prepared a simple meal while Zelda unpacked her few belongings in the bedroom. She emerged as he was frying salt pork and potatoes, and he noticed she had changed into a simpler dress, but still wore the blue gloves. When she moved to help him, reaching for plates to set the table, he saw her wince slightly as if her hands pained her inside the fabric. "You can take off the gloves," Garrett said, keeping his tone casual. "No need for such formality here." "I prefer to keep them on," Zelda said quickly, too quickly, and busied herself with arranging utensils beside the plates. They ate in uncomfortable silence, both exhausted by the day's events and the strangeness of sharing space with someone who was simultaneously a stranger and a betrothed. After dinner, Zelda insisted on washing the dishes despite Garrett's protest that she must be tired, and he watched covertly as she worked, noting how carefully she moved her hands, how she seemed to favor certain positions that kept the gloves from pulling tight across her palms. Over the next several days, as they prepared for, and then held the simple wedding ceremony with the circuit preacher and 2 neighbors as witnesses. Garrett began to notice other small details about his new wife. She never removed her gloves, not even when she helped him in the garden, not even when she kneaded bread dough or scrubbed laundry. She wore different pairs in different colors, always clean and neat, and she changed them frequently as if to prevent any from wearing thin enough to reveal what lay beneath. When she thought he was not looking, he sometimes caught her flexing her fingers as if they ached, or rubbing one hand against the other in a gesture that spoke of discomfort. But more than the mystery of the gloves, Garrett began to notice Zelda herself. She was capable in ways his letters had not fully conveyed, moving through the house and ranch work with an efficiency that spoke of long familiarity with hard labor. She could handle the chickens without flinching, could carry buckets of water without complaint, could judge the heat of the stove for baking with a practiced eye. She did not recoil from dirt or difficulty, and she never asked him to do tasks she could accomplish herself. At the same time, there was a guardedness to her, a way she held herself separate as if waiting for something to go wrong. 2 weeks after the wedding, as they worked together in the kitchen garden pulling weeds that threatened to choke the vegetable plants, Garrett decided to press gently at the mystery that had begun to occupy too many of his thoughts. "Those gloves must be awful hot in this weather," he said, keeping his eyes on the tomato plants he was staking. Zelda's hand stilled for just a moment. "I manage." "I notice you never take them off," Garrett continued carefully. "Not even to sleep, from what I can tell. And I have seen you rubbing at them like they pain you." "It is not your concern," Zelda said, her voice tight. Garrett sat back on his heels and looked at her directly. "Zelda, we are married now. Maybe only for 2 weeks, and maybe we are still learning about each other, but you are my wife. If something pains you, it is my concern." She kept her face turned away, her gloved hands clenched in the dirt. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You would not understand." "Try me," Garrett said. For a long moment, she was silent, and Garrett thought she would refuse to answer. Then she drew a shaky breath and began to speak, still not looking at him. "Before I came here, I worked in a factory in Philadelphia, a textile mill. I worked there for 6 years, since I was 17 years old, after my father died and my mother became ill. The work was hard, and the machines were dangerous, and the overseers cared nothing for our safety as long as we met our quotas. My hands—" She paused, swallowing hard. "My hands were damaged by the work, scarred and calloused and rough, not the hands of a lady, not the hands a man would want to see on his wife." "So you have been hiding them," Garrett said quietly. "Would you not?" Zelda turned to him then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I read your letters, Garrett. You described your ranch and your life and the kind of wife you hoped for. You never said you wanted a factory girl with ruined hands. You wanted someone who could help make a home, someone respectable. I knew if I told you the truth, you would not want me. And I had nowhere else to go." Garrett was quiet for a moment, absorbing this confession. He thought about the neat handwriting of her letters, about the careful way she had presented herself, about the desperation that must have driven her to travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger. "Show me," he said. "What?" Zelda looked startled. "Your hands. Show me what you have been hiding." "No," she said immediately, pulling her hands against her chest protectively. "You will be disgusted. You will regret marrying me." "Zelda," Garrett said, and his voice was gentle but firm. "I am going to see them eventually. You cannot wear gloves for the rest of your life, and I would rather see them now, here, when it is just us, than have it become some terrible secret between us." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Then, with trembling fingers, she began to work at the buttons on her left glove. It took her several tries because her hands were shaking, and Garrett waited patiently, not moving to help her though he wanted to. Finally, she peeled the fabric back and revealed her hand. It was not as terrible as she had clearly feared he would find it, but it was not the smooth, pale hand of a lady either. Her palm was crisscrossed with scars, some thin and white with age, others newer and still slightly pink. Calluses roughened her fingers and the pads of her hand, thick and hard from years of gripping machinery and tools. Her nails were short and practical, and there was a slight crookedness to her index finger, as if it had been broken and healed imperfectly. It was the hand of someone who had worked hard, who had survived, who had built a life through sheer determination and labor. Garrett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. He turned it gently, examining the scars and calluses, feeling the roughness of her palm against his own work-hardened skin. "These hands built a life," he said quietly. "They kept you alive when you had no one to help you. They earned the money to care for your mother. They learned skills and survived dangers and brought you here to this ranch to me. Why would I be disgusted by that?" Zelda made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "They are ugly." "They are honest," Garrett corrected, "and they match mine." He held up his own hand beside hers, showing her the calluses from rope work and fence mending, the scars from broken wire and cattle kicks, and all the minor injuries that came with ranch life. "We both have the hands of people who work. There is no shame in that." "But I lied to you," Zelda said, tears now spilling down her cheeks. "I let you think I was something I was not. You let me think you were a city girl looking for a new start," Garrett said. "And that was true, was it not? You just left out some details about why you needed that new start." "But Zelda, I did not marry you expecting a delicate flower who would faint at the sight of hard work. I needed a partner, someone who could handle ranch life. Seems to me you are exactly that, whether you have rough hands or not." She was crying in earnest now, and Garrett did something he had not done since their awkward wedding day kiss. He pulled her into his arms and held her while she wept, feeling her body shake with the release of weeks of tension and fear. He held her and did not say anything more, just let her cry until the storm passed and she was left hiccuping against his chest. "I was so afraid," she whispered finally. "Afraid you would send me away if you knew the truth." "I am not sending you away," Garrett said firmly. "You are my wife. This is your home, and your hands, rough or smooth, are part of you. I would not change them even if I could, because they are part of what made you strong enough to build this new life." Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. Zelda stopped wearing the gloves constantly, though Garrett noticed she still reached for them sometimes when she was uncertain or nervous, as if they were armor she was not quite ready to fully discard. She worked beside him in the garden and around the ranch, and he saw how capable she truly was, how her years of factory work had given her a strength and endurance that served her well in this new life. She could haul water without complaint, could help him repair fencing when needed, could handle a pitchfork as well as he could. But more than the practical partnership that was developing, Garrett found himself drawn to her in ways he had not anticipated. He liked the way she hummed while she worked, liked her dry sense of humor that emerged as she grew more comfortable, liked the determined set of her jaw when she encountered a new challenge. He liked watching her in the kitchen in the early morning light, her hair not yet pinned up properly, her face soft and unguarded. He liked the rare smile that transformed her whole face when something genuinely pleased her. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Zelda spoke without looking at him. "I should tell you more about before, about why I really came here." Garrett waited, sensing this was important. After my mother died, Zelda continued, I had nothing left in Philadelphia. I had spent 6 years working in that factory, and all the money I earned went to her care and to keeping us housed and fed. I had no savings, no prospects, no family. The other girls at the factory, some of them had turned to other means of supporting themselves, means I did not want to consider, but I knew I could not work in the factory forever. The machines claimed girls all the time. Fingers, hands, arms, some lost more. Some died from the dust in our lungs or from exhaustion. I saw it happen to women I knew, women who had no other choice. She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and Garrett noticed she was not wearing gloves. Her bare, scarred hands were visible in the fading light. I saw the advertisement you placed, she said, and I thought it might be a way out, a chance to live somewhere cleaner, safer, to have a home again instead of a rented room with 3 other girls. I told myself I was being practical, that marriage to a stranger out west was not so different from the arranged marriages rich girls made for money and position. But I knew I was being dishonest by not telling you about my past. I justified it by thinking that once I got here, once you saw I could work hard and be useful, maybe it would not matter so much where I came from. It does not matter, Garrett said. Not in the way you mean. It matters because it is part of your story, part of who you are. But it does not make me think less of you, if anything. He paused, trying to find the right words. If anything, it makes me respect you more. You survived something hard, something that would have broken a weaker person, and you found a way out through your own determination. Zelda turned to look at him then, her eyes searching his face in the dimming light. Why are you so kind to me? We barely know each other. You could have been angry when you learned the truth. I suppose I could have been, Garrett admitted. But anger seemed like a waste when what we both needed was understanding. And as for barely knowing each other, well, we are learning. Every day we know each other a little better. Something changed in her expression, softening. You are not what I expected either. No. Garrett felt a smile tugging at his lips. What did you expect? Someone harder, I think. More demanding. Most of the men I knew in Philadelphia, they looked at women like we were tools to be used or possessions to be owned. You look at me like I am a person, like my thoughts and feelings matter. They do matter, Garrett said simply. You are not a tool or a possession, Zelda. You are my wife, and I hope you will become my partner in truth, not just in name. But that requires both of us being honest with each other, being willing to share the hard things as well as the easy things. As September arrived and the brutal heat of summer began to ease into more tolerable temperatures, Garrett and Zelda fell into a rhythm of life together that felt increasingly natural. They worked side by side during the day, he teaching her about cattle and horses, she sharing knowledge about gardening and preserving food that she had learned from her mother before the factory years. In the evenings, they sat together and talked, sharing stories from their pasts, learning the shapes and textures of each other's histories. Garrett told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father's stern but loving guidance, about his mother's gentle hands and soft songs. He told her about the loneliness that had descended after their deaths, about the silence that had become unbearable, about the fear that had driven him to seek a mail-order bride, because he did not know how else to fill the emptiness. Zelda told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her father who had worked as a clerk and taught her to read and write, about her mother who had sewn beautiful dresses for wealthy clients. She told him about the sudden descent into poverty when her father caught pneumonia and died within a week, about the desperate scramble to find work, about the factory that had been the only place willing to hire her without references or experience. She told him about the noise and the danger and the exhaustion, about the other girls who had become like sisters, about the overseer who had tried to force his attentions on her, until she had threatened him with a piece of machinery and earned herself a reputation as difficult but too valuable to fire. These conversations drew them closer in ways that physical proximity alone could not have accomplished. Garrett found himself thinking about her during the day when they were working separately, wondering what she was doing, eager to share some small observation or thought with her. He noticed how her presence had changed the house from a silent shell into a home, how the smell of bread baking and the sight of curtains she had sewn made the rooms feel alive again. He noticed how his heart lifted when he came in from the barn and saw her moving around the kitchen, how her smile had become something he actively sought to provoke. One night in mid-September, as they were preparing for bed in their separate rooms, Garrett worked up the courage to knock on her door. When she opened it, wrapped in a simple nightdress with her hair in a long braid over her shoulder, he found himself momentarily lost for words at how lovely she looked. "Is something wrong?" Zelda asked, concern crossing her face. "No," Garrett said quickly. "Nothing is wrong, I wanted to ask you something, or maybe tell you something. Both, I suppose." She waited, one hand on the doorframe, and he noticed her hands were bare, the scars visible even in the lamplight. "We have been married for over a month now," Garrett began, aware that he was making a mess of this. "And I know we agreed to take things slowly, to give each other time to adjust. But I wanted you to know that I do not feel like I am adjusting to a stranger anymore. I feel like I am living with someone I care about, someone I look forward to seeing every day. Someone who makes me laugh and makes me think and makes this house feel like home again." Zelda's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting in surprise. "I am trying to say," Garrett continued, pushing past his embarrassment, "that I have feelings for you that go beyond gratitude or partnership. And if you do not feel the same way, that is fine. We can continue as we have been. But if you do feel something, anything, I would like to know. Because I would very much like to kiss you properly, not just that brief peck we shared at the wedding." For a moment, Zelda just stared at him, and Garrett's heart sank as he prepared for rejection. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and reached up to touch his face with her scarred hand. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "I have been feeling it for weeks but was afraid to say anything. Afraid you were just being kind and that I would embarrass us both if I admitted that I have fallen in love with you." "You love me?" Garrett asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I do," Zelda said, and her smile was radiant. "I love your kindness and your patience, and the way you look at me like I am something precious instead of broken. I love how you held my damaged hands and called them honest. I love the life we are building together." Garrett pulled her into his arms and kissed her the way he had been wanting to for weeks, deep and tender and full of all the emotion he had been holding back. She melted against him, her arms coming around his neck, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless, she was laughing softly. "I suppose this means we do not need separate bedrooms anymore," she said, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Only if you want to share mine," Garrett said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I will not presume." "I want to," Zelda said firmly. "I want to be your wife in truth, not just in name." That night marked a new chapter in their marriage, one where the careful politeness gave way to genuine intimacy and affection. They learned each other's bodies with the same patient attention they had learned each other's histories, and Garrett made sure Zelda knew that every part of her, including her scarred hands, was beautiful to him. He kissed her palms and traced her scars with gentle fingers, telling her without words that she was treasured exactly as she was. As autumn progressed, and the work of preparing the ranch for winter consumed their days, Garrett and Zelda functioned as a true team. She helped him drive cattle to better pasture, sitting a horse with increasing confidence despite her initial nervousness around the large animals. He helped her harvest and preserve vegetables from the garden, learning how to can tomatoes and beans under her patient instruction. They worked on repairs to the barn together, Zelda holding boards steady while Garrett hammered, both of them laughing when a particularly stubborn nail bent sideways and had to be pulled out. In early October, they made a trip into Tascosa for supplies, and Garrett noticed how the townspeople who had viewed Zelda with polite but distant curiosity during the wedding now greeted her with genuine warmth. She had won their respect through her regular attendance at church services and her willingness to help other women with their tasks, never putting on airs or acting like ranch life was beneath her. When Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, commented on how well Zelda looked compared to her thin, exhausted appearance when she had arrived, Garrett felt a surge of pride. "Marriage agrees with you," Mrs. Henderson said with a knowing smile, "and it is clear you two are well matched." On the ride home, wagon loaded with flour and sugar and other necessities, Zelda leaned against Garrett's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "I never thought I could be this happy," she said. "When I was working in that factory, I used to dream about having a home and someone to love, but it seemed impossible, like something that happened to other people but never to me." "You deserve happiness," Garrett said, kissing the top of her head. "You deserve everything good in this world." "I have everything I need right here," Zelda replied. "This ranch, this life, it is more than I ever hoped for." Winter arrived with unexpected intensity that year, bringing snow and bitter cold that tested both their preparations and their resolve. Garrett spent long hours ensuring the cattle had adequate shelter and food, often coming in half frozen and exhausted. Zelda had hot meals ready and warmed bricks for his feet, rubbing feeling back into his chilled hands with her own roughened palms. When the worst of the storms hit, they huddled together in the house for days, the world beyond the windows a white howling void. During those long winter nights, they talked about the future they wanted to build together. Zelda expressed interest in expanding the garden come spring, maybe even selling some of their preserved goods in town if they had surplus. Garrett talked about slowly increasing the cattle herd, building up the ranch's reputation and profitability. They both talked, carefully at first and then with increasing ease, about the possibility of children someday. "I think I would like to be a mother," Zelda said one night as they lay tangled together in bed, the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Though the thought terrifies me as much as it excites me." "You would be a wonderful mother," Garrett said, running his fingers through her unbound hair, "patient and strong and loving." "I would want our children to have easier lives than we did," Zelda continued. "To never know hunger or desperation, to have choices we did not have. We will make sure of it," Garrett promised. "Whatever we build here, it will be for them as much as for us." When spring finally arrived in late March, bringing warmth and new growth, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. She told Garrett one evening after supper, her hands pressed against her still flat stomach, her face showing both joy and apprehension. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, searching his face anxiously. "Happy." Garrett swept her into his arms and spun her around until she was laughing and begging him to stop. "Zelda, I am beyond happy. We are going to have a family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer, though Zelda suffered from morning sickness that left her exhausted and queasy for several weeks. Garrett took over more of the heavy work, insisting she rest even though she protested that she was not fragile. As her belly swelled with their child, he found himself overwhelmed with tenderness and protectiveness, constantly worrying about her well-being. "You are hovering," Zelda told him one afternoon in July, amusement in her voice. "I am pregnant, not dying. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my woman carrying my child," Garrett replied stubbornly. "You will humor me in my concern." She laughed and kissed him. "Very well, I will humor you, but I am still helping with the work. I need to stay strong for the birth." In late September, as the anniversary of their meeting approached, Zelda went into labor. Garrett rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, a competent woman who had delivered half the babies in the area. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning, and Garrett aged years in those hours as he listened to Zelda's cries from the bedroom and felt helpless to ease her suffering. When the baby's first wail finally pierced the air, Garrett nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom with a blood-stained apron and a tired smile. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy boy with good lungs. Your wife did wonderfully. She is exhausted but fine. You can go see them now." Garrett entered the bedroom on shaking legs and found Zelda propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket his mother had made years ago, was a tiny red-faced infant with a surprising amount of dark hair. "Come meet your son," Zelda said softly, and Garrett moved to the bedside as if pulled by an invisible cord. He looked down at the baby's scrunched face, at the tiny fingers that were already trying to grip Zelda's scarred hand, and felt his throat tighten with emotion. "He is perfect," Garrett managed to say. "You are perfect, both of you." "What should we name him?" Zelda asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never quite settled on anything definitive. Now, looking at his son, Garrett thought about the future they were building, about the hope and promise represented by this new life. "Thomas," he said finally, "after your father, Thomas Foster." Zelda's eyes filled with tears. "You would honor my father that way." "Of course," Garrett said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "He helped make you who you are, and who you are is the most remarkable person I know." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was a demanding baby who seemed to need constant attention, but neither Garrett nor Zelda minded. They took turns walking the floor with him during the long nights, changed countless diapers, marveled at every small development. Garrett found himself staring at his son for long minutes, overwhelmed by the fierce love he felt for this tiny person who depended on them completely. Zelda took to motherhood with the same determined capability she brought to everything else, though Garrett could see the exhaustion in her face and insisted she rest whenever possible. She nursed Thomas while sitting in the rocking chair Garrett had made during her pregnancy, her scarred hands cradling the baby with infinite gentleness, and Garrett thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. As Thomas grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch prospered. Garrett made smart decisions about cattle purchases and sales, and slowly their herd increased in both size and quality. Zelda's expanded garden produced bountifully, and she began selling preserved goods and fresh vegetables in town, developing a reputation for quality that brought customers from neighboring ranches. The money was modest but steady, allowing them to make improvements to the property and build up savings for the future. When Thomas was 2 years old, Zelda became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and in the spring of 1886, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, after Garrett's mother. Grace was quieter than Thomas had been, a solemn baby with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. With 2 young children and a growing ranch operation, life became a constant juggle of responsibilities, but Garrett and Zelda navigated it together with the partnership they had built. They stole moments alone when they could, after the children were asleep, sitting together on the porch or lying in bed whispering so as not to wake the little ones. These moments were precious, a reminder that beyond the roles of mother and father and rancher and homemaker, they were still Garrett and Zelda, still the two people who had found each other through letters and desperation and built something lasting. One evening in the summer of 1887, as they watched Thomas chase fireflies while Grace dozed in her mother's arms, Zelda turned to Garrett with a reflective expression. "You remember when I first arrived?" she asked. "How terrified I was that you would discover my secrets and reject me." "I remember," Garrett said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "You wore those gloves like armor." "I was so ashamed of my hands," Zelda said, looking down at them where they cradled Grace. The scars were still visible, the calluses still rough, but time and ranch work had added new marks alongside the old ones from the factory. "I thought they made me unworthy of being loved. And now," Garrett asked gently. "Now I see them differently," Zelda said. "These hands worked in a factory and kept me alive. These hands traveled west and built a home. These hands have held our children and helped build this ranch and done 1,000 tasks that matter. You taught me to see them that way when you said they were hands that built a life. You were right. They did build a life. They built this life with you. We built it together," Garrett corrected. "Your hands and mine working side by side." "I love you," Zelda said, leaning into him. "I loved you when you accepted my damaged hands. I loved you when you made me feel safe enough to be honest. I love you more every day we share." "And I love you," Garrett replied, kissing her temple. "Your strength, your courage, your heart, everything you are." Thomas came running up then, his small hands cupped carefully around a captured firefly, demanding his parents admire it before he released it. Garrett lifted his son onto his lap while Zelda adjusted Grace in her arms, and they sat together as a family watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and broken equipment, the constant struggles that came with ranch life. But there were also good harvests and successful sales, visits from neighbors who had become friends, church socials where Thomas and Grace played with other children while their parents shared news and laughter. In 1889, Zelda gave birth to their third child, another son they named James. He was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to find joy in everything. And Thomas and Grace adored their new sibling with the fierce protectiveness of older children. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of family, with children's laughter and crying, with conversations and arguments and reconciliations. As the 1890s began, Garrett and Zelda found themselves looking back on nearly a decade of marriage with satisfaction. The ranch was well established and profitable. Their children were healthy and growing. The partnership they had formed had deepened into a love that sustained them through every difficulty. One anniversary evening, after the children were in bed, Garrett presented Zelda with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" she asked, curiosity lighting her face. "Open it," Garrett said, watching her with barely contained excitement. Inside the package was a pair of leather-work gloves, beautifully made and clearly expensive. Zelda looked at them in confusion for a moment before understanding dawned. "They are not to hide your hands," Garrett said quickly. "They are to protect them. Because your hands matter to me and I want to keep them safe. Because they have built this life we share and they have more building to do." Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks as she pulled the gloves on, flexing her fingers in the soft leather. "They are perfect," she whispered. "Like you," Garrett said, pulling her into his arms. Like us. Like the life we have made together. Thomas graduated from the small schoolhouse in Tascosa in the spring of 1898, a bright boy of 15 with his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's determination. He had decided he wanted to attend college, perhaps study agriculture, so he could bring new knowledge back to help improve the ranch. Garrett and Zelda supported his ambition, proud that their son had opportunities they had never dreamed of at his age. Grace, at 12, was already showing signs of her mother's practical capability and her father's quiet kindness. She helped Zelda with the younger children and the household tasks without complaint. But she also loved working outside with the horses and had announced her intention to become as good a rider as any of the cowboys who sometimes hired on for seasonal work. James, at 9, was still young enough to be carefree, though he already showed interest in every aspect of ranch operations and followed his father around asking endless questions. Garrett answered them all patiently, remembering his own father doing the same for him decades ago. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Zelda discovered she was pregnant again at 39. The pregnancy was unexpected and somewhat worrying given her age, but she delivered a healthy daughter in early 1900 whom they named Catherine. Catherine was a delight, a late blessing who brought new energy to the household even as Garrett and Zelda were beginning to feel their years. As the new century progressed, Garrett and Zelda watched their children grow and begin making their own ways in the world. Thomas returned from college with new ideas for crop rotation and water management that he implemented successfully on the ranch. Grace married a neighboring rancher's son in 1903, a good young man named Daniel who treated her with respect and affection. James showed aptitude for animal husbandry and began building a reputation as someone who could handle even the most difficult horses. Through all these changes and milestones, Garrett and Zelda remained each other's constant. They were in their 40s now, their hair showing gray, their faces marked by years of sun and wind and work. But when Garrett looked at Zelda, he still saw the woman who had stepped off the stage that July day in 1882, proud and frightened and determined. When Zelda looked at Garrett, she still saw the man who had held her damaged hands and called them honest. One evening in the spring of 1905, as they celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary, Garrett and Zelda sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant colors. Catherine, now 5 years old, was playing in the yard under Thomas's watchful eye while Grace and Daniel visited with their infant son, the first grandchild. James was in the barn tending to a mare about to foal. "Did you ever imagine this?" Zelda asked, gesturing at the scene before them. "When you placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, did you imagine it would lead to all of this?" "I imagined a partner," Garrett admitted. "Someone to help ease the loneliness and share the work. But this," he shook his head in wonder, "this exceeds anything I could have imagined. A love like ours, children and grandchildren, a life full of meaning and purpose. You gave me all of that, Zelda." "We gave it to each other," Zelda corrected, taking his hand. Her palm was still rough with calluses, still marked with scars both old and new, and his was the same. They were the hands of people who had worked hard their entire lives, who had built something lasting through determination and love. "These hands built a life," Garrett said softly, echoing the words he had spoken to her so many years ago in the garden. "They did," Zelda agreed, squeezing his fingers. "The best life I could have asked for." As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Garrett and Zelda remained on the porch, hands clasped together, watching their family and counting their blessings. They had started as strangers brought together by necessity and letters, had become partners through honesty and work, and had transformed into lovers through patience and understanding. Now they were simply Garrett and Zelda, husband and wife, their lives so intertwined that neither could imagine existence without the other. The years continued their steady march forward. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations as Garrett's back began to ache from decades of hard labor. Grace gave birth to 2 more children, a boy and a girl, and visited frequently with her growing family. James married a schoolteacher from Tascosa named Ruth, a smart woman who brought books and laughter into their home. Catherine grew from child to young woman, helping her mother with the household and developing a talent for sewing that reminded Zelda of her own mother. In 1910, Garrett and Zelda celebrated their 30th anniversary with a large gathering of family and friends at the ranch. Their children had arranged everything, decorating the barn for dancing and preparing enough food to feed the entire county. As Garrett led Zelda in a slow waltz while their grandchildren watched with delight, he marveled at how blessed they had been. 30 years, he said, looking into Zelda's face. Time had lined it, gray streaked her hair, but she was still beautiful to him. 30 years since you stepped off that stage. The best 30 years of my life, Zelda replied. Though I was terrified that day, certain you would take one look at me and realize you had made a terrible mistake. The only mistake would have been letting you go, Garrett said. You were exactly what I needed, even if I did not know it at the time. We were what each other needed, Zelda said. 2 damaged people who found healing together. As they danced, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had become part of, Garrett thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the loneliness that had driven him to place that advertisement, about Zelda's desperation that had driven her west, about the fears and secrets and hard truths they had shared. He thought about the moment in the garden when he had first seen her scarred hands, when he had made the choice to see strength instead of damage, capability instead of shame. That choice had made all the difference. By accepting Zelda exactly as she was, by valuing her work and her survival and her honesty, he had given her the freedom to become fully herself. And in return, she had given him love and partnership and a life richer than he had ever imagined possible. As the 1910s progressed, Garrett and Zelda gradually transitioned into the role of patriarch and matriarch of their growing family. Thomas ran the ranch with skill and innovation, improving systems and expanding operations in ways that honored his father's legacy while looking toward the future. Grace and Daniel's ranch prospered as well, and the 2 families often worked together on larger projects. James and Ruth built a house on the edge of the property and raised their children within sight of the family home. Catherine eventually married a young veterinarian who set up practice in Tascosa, and their home became a gathering place for family dinners and celebrations. Garrett's health began to decline in 1915, a persistent cough that would not quite go away and a weariness that no amount of rest seemed to cure. The doctor from Amarillo diagnosed chronic bronchitis, likely from decades of working in dust and weather, and prescribed rest and warm, dry conditions. Garrett complied reluctantly, frustrated by his body's limitations but grateful for Zelda's constant presence at his side. They spent long hours together that year, sitting on the porch or in the sitting room, talking about their lives and memories. They laughed about their awkward early days of marriage, about Zelda's determination to hide her hands and Garrett's careful attempts to make her comfortable. They reminisced about their children's childhoods, about the challenges and triumphs of building the ranch, about the community they had become part of, and the friends they had made. I would not change a single thing, Garrett said one afternoon as they sat together, his hand clasped in hers. Every moment, every challenge, every joy. It was all worth it because I shared it with you." "I feel the same way," Zelda said, tears glistening in her eyes. "You saved me, Garrett. You saved my life by seeing me as worthy of love." "You saved mine too," Garrett replied. "I was drowning in loneliness before you came. You brought light and life and love back to this house, back to my heart." Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in the early spring of 1916, with Zelda beside him and his children gathered close. He was 60 years old, and he had lived a good life full of love and purpose. The funeral was attended by everyone in Tascosa and the surrounding ranches, testament to the respect and affection he had earned over 3 decades. Zelda grieved deeply, feeling the loss of her partner and love with an intensity that left her breathless. But she was surrounded by the family they had built together, by children and grandchildren who loved her and needed her. She found purpose in being there for them, in passing on the stories and lessons that she and Garrett had learned together. She lived for another 12 years, spending them immersed in family life and community. She taught her granddaughters to sew and preserve food, shared stories of Philadelphia and the factory, and the journey west with anyone who would listen. She never tried to hide her scarred hands, wearing them as badges of honor that represented everything she had survived and built. When young women in difficult circumstances came to her for advice, she told them honestly about her own struggles and her own journey, about finding strength in themselves and being willing to take chances on new possibilities. In the summer of 1928, at 70 years old, Zelda passed away surrounded by her children and many of her grandchildren. She died peacefully, her scarred hands folded on her chest, a slight smile on her face. Her children laid her to rest beside Garrett on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, the land that had witnessed their love story unfold. The ranch continued through the generations, with Thomas passing it to his eldest son, who passed it to his children in turn. But the story of Garrett and Zelda was never forgotten. It became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what love built on honesty and acceptance could achieve. The old gloves that Garrett had given Zelda on their anniversary were preserved in a glass case in the family home, along with the letters they had exchanged before meeting and a photograph from their 30th anniversary showing them hand in hand, their scarred and weathered hands clasped together. Decades later, when descendants of Garrett and Zelda gathered at the ranch for reunions, they would tell the story of the mail-order bride who hid her rough hands in gloves and the cowboy who said those hands built a life. They told it as a reminder that true love sees past surface imperfections to the strength and beauty beneath, that honesty and acceptance form the foundation of lasting partnership, and that the most meaningful lives are built not through avoiding hardship, but through facing it together with someone who values you for exactly who you are. The story became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of second chances, to the possibility of finding love and purpose even when circumstances seemed desperate. It honored the courage it took for Zelda to travel west alone, to risk rejection, to eventually trust Garrett with her truth. It celebrated Garrett's wisdom in seeing past societal expectations of what a lady's hands should look like to appreciate the strength and capability represented by Zelda's scars and calluses. Most of all, it was a love story in the truest sense. Not the fairy tale version where everything is easy and perfect, but the real version where two imperfect people chose each other, worked through their fears and secrets, and built something beautiful and lasting through dedication and genuine affection. It was a story of hands that worked hard, that bore the marks of struggle and survival, that held each other through decades of life's ups and downs. It was a story of the Wild West, of ranching and hard living and finding community in harsh conditions. But more than anything, it was a story of love that transformed two lonely, damaged people into a complete and thriving whole. The ranch still stands today, now in its fifth generation of family ownership, much expanded and modernized but still recognizable as the place Garrett built with his father and later shared with Zelda. The original house has been preserved as a historical landmark, maintained with care by descendants who understand its significance. Visitors can tour the rooms where Garrett and Zelda lived and loved, can see the kitchen where they cooked together, the bedroom where their children were born, the porch where they sat watching sunsets and counting their blessings. And in the small cemetery on the hill, two headstones stand side by side, weathered now by a century of Texas sun and wind. One reads Garrett Foster, 1856–1916, beloved husband, father, and friend. The other reads Zelda Lawrence Foster, 1858–1928, beloved wife, mother, and survivor. Between them, carved into a third marker placed by their children, are the words that define their relationship and their legacy. These hands built a life together. Those words encapsulate everything about their story. The hands that worked in factories and on ranches, that were scarred by machines and roughened by rope and weather, that held children and each other, that built a home and a family and a legacy. The hands that Zelda had tried to hide but Garrett had seen clearly and valued completely. The hands that represented everything they had survived, everything they had accomplished, everything they had become together. In the end, Garrett and Zelda's story is not unusual in the broad strokes. The Wild West era saw many mail-order bride arrangements, many marriages of convenience that began between strangers. But what made their story special was how they chose to approach those circumstances. They could have maintained a polite but distant partnership, never fully trusting each other with their deepest fears and truths. Instead, they chose vulnerability and honesty. They chose to see each other as complete people worthy of respect and love, not as solutions to practical problems. They chose to build not just a working relationship, but a genuine love story. That choice made all the difference. It transformed what could have been a lonely, merely functional marriage into a deep and lasting love that sustained them through 3 decades, and continues to inspire their descendants generations later. It proved that love is not about perfection or meeting societal expectations, but about accepting each other's realities and choosing to build something meaningful together despite, and sometimes because of imperfections. The gloves that Zelda wore that first day, the armor she used to hide her shame, became symbols in the family's collective memory. They represented the fears and insecurities everyone carries, the parts of ourselves we think make us unworthy of love. And Garrett's response, his acceptance and appreciation of her scarred hands, became a model for how love should work. Not demanding perfection or conformity, but seeing the truth of a person and valuing them for exactly who they are. As the sun sets over the Texas Panhandle, casting long shadows across the ranch that has borne the Foster name for nearly a century and a half, the story of Garrett and Zelda lives on. It lives in the land they cultivated and the family they raised. It lives in the values they instilled in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It lives in every person who hears their story and finds courage to show their own scars, to trust someone else with their vulnerabilities, to believe that love based on honesty and acceptance is possible. The Wild West era that formed the backdrop of their love story has long since passed into history. The harsh frontier conditions they navigated have been tamed by progress and technology. But the human truths at the heart of their story remain as relevant now as they were in 1882. Everyone carries scars, visible or invisible. Everyone has parts of themselves they fear might make them unworthy of love. And everyone needs someone who will look at those scars and say, as Garrett said to Zelda, that these marks represent survival and strength, that they are nothing to be ashamed of, that they tell the story of a life built through determination and courage. That is the legacy Garrett and Zelda left behind. Not just a successful ranch or a large family, though those are significant achievements, but a model for how to love authentically and completely, how to build a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection, how to transform desperate circumstances into something beautiful through honesty and hard work. Their story reminds us that the roughest hands can build the most beautiful lives, that the hardest beginnings can lead to the happiest endings, and that true love sees past surface imperfections to honor the strength and beauty of the human spirit beneath. In the evening light, as descendants gather at the ranch for another family reunion, someone inevitably asks to hear the story again. And someone always tells it, passing it on to yet another generation. They tell about the mail-order bride who hid her rough hands in gloves, terrified of rejection. They tell about the cowboy who saw those hands and recognized their worth. They tell about the love that grew between two strangers who had every reason to remain guarded, but chose trust instead. They tell about the life built together through decades of partnership, challenge, joy, and unwavering affection. And as they tell it, hands clasp hands around the gathering. Rough hands and smooth ones, young hands and old ones, scarred hands and unmarked ones. All of them connected by the story of Garrett and Zelda, by the reminder that our hands tell the stories of our lives, and there is no shame in that. Only honor in the work they have done, the people they have touched, the lives they have built. These hands built a life. Not just Garrett's words to Zelda in that garden so long ago, but a truth that echoes through generations. Our hands, with all their scars and imperfections, build the lives we live. They build homes and families and communities. They build connections between hearts. They build love that lasts beyond lifetimes, love that becomes legend, love that transforms the world one small ranch, one acceptance, one honest touch at a time. And so the story ends where all the best love stories end, with two people who found each other against the odds, who built something beautiful together, and who left a legacy that outlived them both. Garrett Foster and Zelda Lawrence Foster, cowboy and mail-order bride, husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. Their story is complete, their ending happy, their love eternal in the memories of all who came after them and in the very land itself, which still bears the imprint of their capable, scarred, beautiful hands that built not just a ranch but a life worth remembering.